it's been lost to history the fact that the Arab Higher Committee actually called upon the Arabs in Israel to leave after the Declaration of Independence because they thought that the 5 neighboring Arab states were going to crush Israel immediately, and they wanted the Arabs out of harm's way so they could kill the Jews and then they would let them come back. And of course, it didn't work out that way. They didn't end up winning the war. Every last other war, including the ones that America fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were many more civilians killed than there have been in Gaza. Gaza, in the IDF, has actually set a record for the fewest proportion of civilians killed. And yet they get excoriated for just the opposite. And it reminds me of Mark Twain's old adage that the lie goes around the world twice. It's certainly true that in Hamas you're celebrated if you kill Jews, while the Germans tried to cover it up. But it's also true that some German civilians risked their own lives to protect Jews. And there are many stories available of these civilians hiding Jews, like this is not in Germany, but in the Netherlands, the people who hid Anne Frank and her family in, what was it, the attic or the cellar, whatever it was. But in any case, the story. And in Gaza, every last hostage that's been released has said there are no innocent civilians there.
I'm honored today to have with me Robert Spencer of Jihad Watch. He is the author, most recently, of that's one of his other books, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam. But most recently, he has been writing, he has a book, Antisemitism, History and Myth. Let me put it up here so people can see it. Mr. Spencer, tell us a little bit about yourself, Jihad Watch. What is Jihad Watch watching amongst the jihad these days? And tell us a particular case about the benign Buddhist from Vermont. I think his name is Mohsen Mahdawi.
Yeah. Well, in the first place, Jihad Watch is a news and commentary site. I believe it's unique. I don't know of any other that covers jihad activity in the United States and around the world every day at jihadwatch.org. There are many things we cover all the time. The site's updated many times daily. Of course, we are keeping close watch on the war in Gaza, which is a classic jihad, and you can always find explanations there as to why it fits into the framework of jihad that is completely ignored in the Western foreign policy establishment. And of course, there's the ongoing jihad in Africa, particularly in Nigeria, but not restricted by any means to Nigeria, and jihad attacks here and there all around the world. Speaking of Buddhists, before we get to the famous Buddhist Mahdawi, there was an attack in southern Thailand very recently where a novice Buddhist monk was murdered as a Muslim group drove by and just shot at him and another monk on their motorcycle. This kind of thing is unfortunately all too common. And we at Jihad Watch explain how all these different disparate attacks around the world are actually motivated by a unified single ideology, which is almost completely ignored worldwide.
So what is that ideology? I mean, I think I've seen the map, of Islam spread. It's people. I'm a medical doctor, and we're familiar with infectious disease. It would be called an epidemic, something like that, if it would spread in that vein. But I'm going to be visiting Hungary in June, and I was looking over the history of Hungary. There was, speaking of Buddhists, there was the Battle of Buda, different term there, and it wasn't that long ago, 1688. And so I was looking at what is the Battle of Buda? I mean, there's Buda and Pest. People think it was one place, but it's two towns glued together, kind of like the Twin Cities. And so that was a 78-day siege of the Ottomans who were sitting in Budapest. And the Battle of Vienna, I think, was around that same time. All up and through Spain, up into what's now southern France. Um, Islam has been on the march. It's a rarity for it to be kind of repelled. What's all that about? Is there kind of in a sense, this third crusade kind of courage around to reclaim or claim what was a society different from Islam?
Oh no, nobody's talking about any kind of crusade. Nobody's even aware of this as a threat. Very few people, I should say. Most of the entire political establishment in the West thinks of Islam as a completely benign spiritual religion after the manner of Judaism and Christianity, and has no reason whatsoever to discourage its growth in the West. And so it is growing quickly in the West, and we will see that jihad resuming on a large scale. But the idea, the motivating ideology there is encapsulated in a statement of Muhammad in a hadith. I have been commanded to fight against people until they confess that there is no God but Allah and I am his messenger. And when they do, their lives and property will be safe from me. In other words, if they don't, their lives and property will not be safe from him. So it's an open-ended declaration of war against anyone who does not confess that there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger.
It's been a fairly successful proposition. When I was in Morocco in the late 70s, and the Berbers were there, but this concept that these were all Arab people. They're speaking Arabic in Morocco. Morocco didn't speak Arabic originally. There were peoples there who were not Arabic. It's pretty fairly easy to, see that the people of Somalia might speak Arabic, but they're not Arabs. And there have been various waves of, we'll call it I can't even say it, proselytizing, proselytation, whatever the word would be, of peoples, but it wasn't necessarily by cajoling. I mean, my understanding is a fair amount of conversion is by the sword.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. You and I have English names, and yet we're not English because the English amassed a great empire. And for various other reasons, we end up speaking English and having these names when we are not actually people of English. Well, I'm speaking for myself, but I don't think that we are people of English descent. In any case, it's the same thing in North Africa and all around the Middle East. Strictly speaking, the Arabs are the people in Arabia. And the other people who call themselves Arabs are the product of colonialist expansion that has been completely effaced from the memory of the Western world. And yet, the Western world actually, Europe, I mean, in particular, resisted that colonialist expansion and fought against it for well over 1,000 years. And yet, the children and heirs of the people who fought those battles have now completely forgotten that they ever took place at all.
There's there's almost like no pride about it. I mean, these memories are not, in a sense, that long ago. I mean, the 17th century may seem like a while ago, but the Islam was at the gates of Vienna. It just doesn't seem that it's really taught. I wasn't taught that in school. I was unaware. And you hear about the Ottoman Empire, you never really hear about kind of the Islamic thrust behind it. And my kids now they're adult men, but maybe 15, 20 years ago they were in school here, and they were talking about the origins of slavery, and everything was kind of the white guy, whatever. But I sent an email to the teacher that slavery is kind of a thing that goes all around the world. I mean, every people has enslaved every other people pretty much if you go back far enough. And the word slave obviously it connotes with Slavic, so what's up with that? And but the extant slave trade, such as it is, never really stopped under in fair amount of the Islamic world. I mean, I think it's kind of a hush-hush topic to the extent that it exists today, and it probably does. But nobody really talks about it. Everyone's willing, in a sense, to talk about kind of slave labor or prison labor use in China, but nobody really talks about kind of the slave trade that never really went out of style or out of phase in the Islamic world, and the complicity in the original kind of slave trade of the U.S. and whatnot in parceling people around. I mean, am I way off base on this? And B, why is it always getting a pass?
Well, you're completely right. As obviously, slavery is indeed still going on in the Islamic world. A lot of times it's under the table. For example, Saudi Arabia prohibited slavery in 1962. When I was in high school, I remember being taught that the last country in the world to outlaw slavery was Brazil in 1889. And nobody told us, speaking of whitewashing, that the Saudis didn't outlaw slavery until 1962, that Niger didn't outlaw slavery until 2007, that it still exists. It's widespread in some areas of North Africa, Mauritania, Niger, Chad, and so on. In Saudi Arabia, it still goes on because it's sanctioned within Islam. And I was criticizing the English for their colonialism, or at least discussing English colonialism earlier. So now I will balance that by noting that it was the English and the Americans who were Christians who originated the idea that slavery was immoral. As you noted, every last culture in the world took slavery as for granted as something that was completely morally acceptable until the 18th century in England and in America, when the abolitionist movement arose and ultimately won out and got slavery not only outlawed but assumed to be immoral universally around the world, with, once again, the notable exception of pockets of the Islamic world. And yet, there was never any abolitionist movement in the Islamic world. The only reason why any Islamic states or majority Muslim states ever outlawed slavery was under pressure from the West. And so here again, this kind of thing is completely unknown. And this is in part because Islamic groups have been very skillful in their manipulation of history and historical textbooks in particular, in the West. And it's as if they have thoroughly imbibed the adage, I believe it was of Lenin, and it was the communists who said, "He who controls the past controls the future." And they are busy whitewashing the Islamic past. Slavery is actually just one aspect of that, and presenting this vision of Islam that corresponds to no reality ever. And that's what American school children and European school children are learning.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a professor friend from my medical school days. He was a professor, and then he became a friend. And he's an older guy, obviously, than I. And I saw him recently, and we were talking about a variety of topics. And I forget exactly how Israel Gaza came up, but invariably it does these days. And he said, "Oh, the genocide, like 40,000 people died. You don't believe that, the genocide?" And it's kind of, that's a different conflation of history. That's kind of a borrowing or theft of history in a sense. The opposite of genocide, and the way the war actually gets conducted. But I'm gonna touch on a fair number of this aspect, but I don't know if you've probably seen this video. It's old because based on the way the guy is dressed, but it's a professor in Cairo, from what I understand, and he says, "Look, I think this is the time they were discussing land for peace, so it's a little bit dated for today." But he said, "Look, this is never about land for peace. If it's a religious war," is what he said. And I mean, I'm not sure if it was the Sadat era or Mubarak era, but he goes on. He says, "Look, if tomorrow every Jew and Christian in Israel converted to Islam, there would be no war. They'd be part of the Ummah, and they're basically, it's a team sport, and that's that. This would be solved tomorrow." And I brought this up to many of my co-religionists, even including some former Israeli, Israeli expats, and they kind of they hadn't really thought of it that way. It's a funny thing. I'm not sure he's right. I think he is right because that seems to be the general pattern. Lebanon, the problem in Lebanon as a Christian country was the Christians, it seems, and they've been somewhat reduced in size and number and exiled and whatnot, either self or otherwise. And once it's Islamic, that kind of falls in another category. Nobody really thinks about it anymore as having to hew to the standards of worldwide propriety. If it becomes Palestine from the river to the sea, that's going to be the last you ever hear about it. It seems about whether there's any type of genociding going on or anything of the sort.
Yeah. Well, of course there isn't. The West Point professor John Spencer, who's no relation, and the British Colonel Richard Kemp have conducted separately independent studies that indicate that the civilian to combatant ratio of the people killed in Gaza is less than 1-to-1, which is unprecedented in the history of warfare. That is, every other war where any kind of measures have been taken, any kind of studies have been undertaken in this regard, every last other war, including the ones that America fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were many more civilians killed than there have been in Gaza. In Gaza, the IDF has actually set a record for the fewest proportion of civilians killed, and yet they get excoriated for just the opposite. And it reminds me of Mark Twain's old adage that the lie goes around the world twice, but while the truth is still putting on its shoes. That Hamas was claiming all this time since October 7th, 2023, that 70% of the people that Israel was killing in Gaza were women and children. And they just quietly walked that back and admitted that 70% were actually males of military age. And that doesn't get nearly the kind of coverage that the lie got. And that's the whole idea.
Well,
Saturate the world
more of it's
quietly
almost
about truth. And when
it's
it's too
almost
late.
purposeful. It seems. I mean, Hamas's strategy is not of this day. Basically, I think they take up the mantle of Iran. They're looking for some paradisical um, uh, place in the future, and they're willing to sacrifice now. So Hamas stands behind. You always hope a government stands behind the citizens, but literally, in this case, Hamas stands behind its citizens, but uses them as a shield for weapons and literally tunnels underneath them. So how do you get at the problem? If I think it's purposeful that Israel does everything it can to protect the civilians, and Hamas does everything it can to protect itself. And the citizens are there, and you need to get through them to get at them. That's why they're under hospitals or within hospitals, within schools, and so forth. And so, kind of, it's an extra bonus point if you want to award such things to be able to so finely dissect out and get a 70% military age male, and who are not necessarily all honest civilians. I mean, the whole society in a sense has been militarized. Douglas Murray pointed out that in some ways this is worse than Nazi Germany. In Nazi Germany, they actually had to hide the atrocities perpetrated on Jews. In Hamasistan, you would be, pretty much you kill a Jew, you can go, march down the street, celebrate, and carry the hide, and who knows what happens. Hilarity ensues. It's just kind of it's just miraculous to me that this can be the mantle upon which our society and our students, which I always kind of remind is the same word as Taliban. Taliban are theoretically students, but our students here in the United States, and probably the Jewish, most Jewish centric city in the U.S., New York City, in the heart of New York City, the Jewish students can't walk around actively visibly Jewish. And so I don't know. There's a lot there, but we can kind of circle back to what's going on in Colombia. But I don't know if you have any comments on anything I said so far.
Well, it's even worse than what Douglas Murray says, because it's certainly true that in Hamas you're celebrated if you kill Jews, while the Germans tried to cover it up. But it's also true that many, not many, but some German civilians risked their own lives to protect Jews. And there are many stories available of these civilians hiding Jews, like in, this is not in Germany, but in the Netherlands, the people who hid Anne Frank and her family in, what was it, the attic or the cellar, whatever it was. But in any case, you know the story. And in Gaza, every last hostage that's been released has said there are no innocent civilians there. Every last one of them is in on this and wholeheartedly committed to making life as miserable for the hostages and killing Jews as they can, that is, and killing Jews and so on.
Yeah, no, Eric Metaxas has written on Bonhoeffer, and he was I think, a Lutheran minister. But the church ostensibly, and there are obviously going to be corrupted parts in the Nazi era, but for the most part, the church is, you would not go to the church and do your bidding and so forth. And here, lots of things are again done under the auspices, figuratively and literally under the under the roof of the mosques. And I think it's it's basically a religious war, as Jihad Watch name implies. Um, and if in fact you were a Bonhoeffer, I don't think you'd even get to the stage of being Bonhoeffer in Gaza today. I think it's a homogenous. People talk about like genocide or whatever. How many Jews are in Gaza? I think it's a pretty low number, and that probably goes across. Yeah, and it goes pretty much across the board. In Yemen, I think there are five, and there had been tens of thousands in 1947, and pretty much ditto in Iraq, and I don't know. I think there may be a handful in Syria, like a couple, maybe 100 in Lebanon. I mean, these are places that had tens of thousands of Jews in 1948, and in the case of Iraq, hundreds of thousands of Jews, and all across. This is nobody really talks about kind of the asymmetry of the situation, where every place, Judenreich is a Nazi term, German word, but pretty much that's the entire Islamic world, with the exception of Iran, which does have some Jews, but everybody else, every place else, they're fairly much hounded out of existence or made to turn tail.
Yeah, well, this was a concerted effort in 1948 after the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel that 900,000 Jews were expelled from the Middle East and North Africa. Nobody ever talks about their right of return. Meanwhile, it's been lost to history the fact that the Arab Higher Committee actually called upon the Arabs in Israel to leave after the Declaration of Independence because they thought that the five neighboring Arab states were going to crush Israel immediately. And they wanted the Arabs out of harm's way so they could kill the Jews and then they would let them come back. And of course, it didn't work out that way. They didn't end up winning the war.
But there's another war. There's a secondary war, which seems to be like, to misuse the word, but it's kind of a world war. Just the other day in Sweden, I think there's an Israeli company hanging out, and I think people were shot leaving that company. That's Stockholm. But it wouldn't shock anybody on any given day to see, some Israeli or Jewish concern, or somebody who's even selling to Israelis or Jew, getting, in harm's way. It could be, I'm making this up, but it could be Adelaide, Australia. It could be Jakarta. It could be anywhere on Earth. It seems like it's a concerted effort, and that is a form of cold, bordering on boiling war. What's the kind of, I don't know, situation as far as you see it, and before we kind of settle on latest events around Colombia?
Well, you're right that there's an explosion of hatred of Jews around the world. And while it is under the guise of anti Zionism, so called, and opposition to Israel and anger at the fictional Jewish genocide or the genocide being perpetrated by the Jews in Gaza, supposedly, uh, it is actually quite open hatred of Jews themselves. For example, there was just on, I'm not really familiar with this guy, but apparently there's some very famous sports guy, Dave Portnoy, who has Barstool Sports, and he was having some sort of a gathering, and somebody held up a sign that was not directed at Israel or Zionists, but at Jews. And Portnoy, to his credit, he's upset about it. He identified the guy who was a Muslim who held up the sign, and he's apologizing for it having gone out over the air. But the thing is that I think epitomizes the fact that this is a recrudescence of hatred of Jews as such, that is using the lies about Gaza and genocide and all that just as an excuse to manifest itself once again. And that it's being driven, as I show in the book, actually, by primarily by the left. There are four primary historical sources of anti-Semitism: Christianity, Islam, National Socialism, and International Socialism. And of those four, only Christianity has ever repudiated it, but there are still Christian anti-Semites here and there, some of them quite prominent nowadays. But the primary driver of anti-Semitism today is the left and its collectivist impulse, which runs right against the idea of a particular state for one small people, and they can't abide such a thing. So Israel has to go, and they are teaming up with Islamic jihadis who want Israel destroyed because the Quran tells them, drive them out from where they drove you out, which they understand to mean that any land that was once ruled under Islamic law belongs by right to the Muslims forever. They have the responsibility before Allah to drive out those who drove them out, that is, to destroy whatever other government may be in place instead of Islamic one based on Islamic law, and restore the rule of Islamic law there. And the left and the Islamic groups are working together, particularly on college campuses today, to mobilize resistance against Israel and hatred of Jews in general.
So let's talk about our pacifist Mohsen Mahdawi.
Yeah, this is it's such a propaganda campaign, a cynical, truth-free, brazen propaganda campaign on the part of these leftist and Islamic groups. This is Mohsen Mahdawi, who is supposedly a Palestinian. He may well be, but every aspect that we know about from his backstory turns out to be a lie. He's very fishy from the beginning because, in the first place, he's 34 years old and he's at Columbia University. And he was just ordered deported by the Trump administration for the same reasons that Mahmoud Khalil, who was his friend and colleague at Columbia University Apartheid Divest, was deported. And although Mahmoud Khalil, a judge, ruled that the deportation could go ahead and was justified, for Mohsen Mahdawi, a different judge, stopped it and freed Mahdawi from custody. And both Mahdawi and Mahmoud Khalil are, of course, being celebrated as heroes by the left today, celebrated in the media as if they are noble and innocent martyrs of the Trump administration. But it's not true in either case. And, well, there's plenty of information about Mahdawi that shows that it's not the case, and that the judge rather brazenly ignored when freeing Mahdawi. This guy, in the first place, as I noted, he's 34 years old, and he's an undergraduate at Columbia. Now, what are you, 21 when you graduate from college ordinarily? And people assumed that he was some kind of graduate student, but he's an undergrad. And he seems to be a professional undergrad. He came to the United States 10 years ago and enrolled in college, and he's still an undergrad, even though he already has 2 degrees from other universities. So what on earth? He's either a slacker, a slacker of unprecedented proportions, or he's a professional agitator who's staying on at Columbia as an undergrad in order to be there as a spur to stir up anti-Israel and anti-Jewish sentiment when needed. And that's what he's been doing.
Yeah, I think that's pretty successful. How does he manage to be a? First of all, is the College of General Studies, is that real Columbia? Harvard has one of those things, and you don't have to actually have gotten into Harvard the kind of official way. There's kind of an ancillary, for the general public version of Harvard, Harvard Light, if you will. You can just sign up for courses. Is that the Columbia he's at? A, and then B, what's he doing living in Vermont if he's like a full-time student at Columbia?
Yeah, well, that's another thing. As far as the question of his enrollment status, all I know is that he's an undergrad. He may have gotten in through this program. I didn't see that when I was researching on him. Like I say, it may be, but I don't know. But it's another fishy aspect of his very fishy resume all around, that he indeed is a resident of Vermont. There is, I'm sure we'll get to it, there is more about his deeply sketchy record that takes place in Vermont. And yet he is a full-time student, supposedly. Although, you would think a full-time student who's now in his at least 10th year of a 4-year program, how, and you might think if some guy is working all the time, maybe working 2 jobs or whatever, and he can only take one course at a time, and maybe not any courses for several semesters, so that he just is barely hanging on and trying to get his undergraduate degree over 10 years. That's I'm sure that's happened. But this guy, he's a full-time student. So how is it that he is a resident of Vermont? He must be in New York for at least 9 months out of the year.
I don't know the answer to all those things. There's something about his boasting. He's killed Jews. He's going to kill more.
Yeah, well, that's the Vermont piece. He was in Windsor, Vermont, and he went into a gun store. And he got into a conversation with the guy who's working at the gun store, and he was boasting. He said, "I like to kill Jews." And he said that I've killed plenty of Jews. I worked in back in Palestine. I killed Jews with this kind of gun. And he's looking around and shopping for guns with the clear implication that he wants to kill more Jews. Now, this is in the affidavit that the government filed in defense of deporting him. And he denies this. He says, "Oh, no, this never happened. And it must be that the gun store employee hates Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians. And so he made up this story about how he was boasting about him wanting to kill Jews." Now, here's where I can tell you that it's his word against the guy who's saying it from the gun store. But why do I not believe Mohsen Mahdawi? Because I've seen it over and over and over again that in the United States today, it is a very tremendous professional risk to appear to be what is called Islamophobic. Islamophobia is a completely bogus concept that was made up in the 1990s, and it's designed to intimidate people into being afraid to criticize jihad violence and Sharia oppression of women and so on. But it's been very effective. And nowadays, college presidents, especially when they're called upon to condemn the anti-Semitism on their campuses, they routinely condemn anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, as if Muslim students were being victimized as well, and they're not, nor should they be. Now, Mohsen Mahdawi walks into a gun store. Do I think that the gun shop employee decided, "Oh, here's an Arab Muslim, let me make up some stories about him and try to get him in trouble for saying he wants to kill Jews"? Look, in the first place, He wasn't even in trouble until Trump became president again. The Biden administration doesn't care if he wanted to kill Jews. He had no immigration worries until January 20th, 2025. And so this guy made this up from years ago. Why? And also, if the guy made up the story, it's much more likely, given today's cultural climate, that the employee would be charged with Islamophobia and get fired and ruined than it would be that Mohsen Mahdawi would get prosecuted for saying that. So I believe the gun guy. And I think that he said it, and now it's become inconvenient for him. So he's denying that he said it.
So this judge, I don't know what level of judge that was, but I was in Vermont, I guess. Let him go on his own recognizance. Does that mean he can be picked up again? What's the status ultimately of this case? Do you know?
Yeah, he's still in Dutch. He can get picked up again. The Trump administration has not stopped pursuing the case, and I suppose it's going to mount an appeal to the judge freeing him and state the case to a higher level judge and hope that he can once again be scheduled for deportation. But right now he's a free man. He could show up here.
Lovely. So what kind of I guess thrust do you have with Jihad Watch? Who's paying attention? Who's listening? How are things working out, say locally versus worldwide?
Well, most people, I mean, I don't know what you mean by who's listening. Of course, I don't have any role in the Trump administration or contact with anybody there. I don't know if anybody's reading the material. There are many things that they are doing that are much better than what the Biden administration was doing, but they also have betrayed the fact that they don't know the nature and magnitude of this threat, just as the Biden administration didn't. They are not actively aiding America's enemies, as the Biden administration was, giving $20 billion to Iran after October 7th and a couple of billion to Hamas after October 7th. And they said, oh, it's humanitarian aid. Look, okay, but who's on the ground in Tehran to make sure they don't use our money for nefarious, non-humanitarian purposes? Anthony Blinken says, oh, we strictly told them they could only use it for humanitarian purposes. Oh, yeah, they're certainly going to respect that. And so I don't have any inside track or anything. I'm just hoping that if I keep stating the truth, somebody might notice it and act upon it.
How has it made your life?
Well, I've been doing this a lot of years. I started studying this in the early 80s, went public after 9/11, started writing books. They've tried to kill me twice. They failed both times. And as in case you weren't sure, and I've gotten thousands of death threats, but actually, that's not even the worst of it. The worst of it is that the leftist establishment that's in league with the jihadis has branded me some sort of a right-wing extremist and so on for talking about this because they don't want to talk about Islamic jihad, and they claim it doesn't exist and that it's just bigotry and Islamophobia. And that has, because those groups, such as the Southern Poverty Law Center and the ADL, they have so much clout that has caused a lot of trouble. But it comes with the territory. You're going to tell the truth nowadays. It's a very unpopular proposition.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? And I think we have like an imperative to tell the truth, and it's just what is it? Stalin said, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths are a statistic. It seems like the enormity of it. People can understand one thing happening. Like what Alex Jones' career got upended over his one statement about that one tragic killing in school shooting in Connecticut. Now, if that school shooting happened, it happens far too much, mind you. But if it happened with the frequency of jihad events, we probably wouldn't have any kids around. I mean, it's, it just seems like the constant backdrop of another killer. South Park has that meme. The news reporter does not want to announce who it is. They always, name withheld. Um, and then it's like, and it's a Muslim. I don't know if you've ever seen that one, but one way or another, people seem to like take account of an event, whether they're going to put it down the memory hole or display it based on who the perpetrators are. So if it's Derek Chauvin, you never hear the end of it. If it's George Zimmerman, whom they thought was white before it turns out he has like part Latino with it, as if that matters, you didn't stop hearing about it. But all the New Orleans ramrodding, the Christmas markets throughout Germany, people stop talking about it. They just don't hear anything about it. What has to happen? It seems like 9/11 was an occurrence that galvanized people and maybe people somewhat aware, but it's perverse. Like October 7th, I thought would be an incident where it be the actual barbarity they recorded themselves, and like the type of killing, murdering, incineration of families, mass rape, all this kind of horror, like the worst kind of the worst. Again, stuff that you wouldn't be able to perpetrate in the streets of Nazi Germany even, and that was bad enough. Don't get me wrong. It's like caused some weird counter reaction. I just don't fathom it.
Well, I think that goes back to the imperative that the left and the Islamic groups have to spread hatred of Jews in order to eradicate the state of Israel, which the left thinks is an obstacle to its internationalist collectivist plans, and the Islamic world wants to destroy because it believes the land belongs to Islam. And so they're working together to spread the propaganda to demoralize and confuse people in the West so as to isolate Israel on the global stage and ultimately destroy it.
Well, I don't think it's reserved for Israel per se. I mean, it seems like there are, a fair amount of church burnings in France, and it just seems like you're going to, well, let's say, God forbid, you get rid of Israel or whatever tomorrow. Does that mean jihad stops?
No, it's in the Quran, chapter 8, verse 39. Fight them until persecution is no more and religion is all for Allah. So you mentioned in France, if they're minding their own business in France, but their religion is not all for Allah, then there are some believers in that book and that prophet and that religion who are going to think they have a responsibility to wage war against the people who are not Muslim in France and elsewhere. And so the jihad never ends. If they destroy Israel tomorrow, then they will go on to the next target until the whole world is conquered and Islamized. There, as long as there are believers in Muhammad and Islam and the Quran, there will be jihad.
So when did the Moors take over the Iberian Peninsula?
7/11. That was the year. That is.
So that wasn't to get rid of Jews. I mean that
No.
when they took over, basically a good fraction of Eastern Europe, that wasn't because of Jews. I mean that was.
No,
I think it seems to be.
jihad.
Yeah, it seems to be relatively agnostic. I mean, the Crusades are kind of framed unilaterally in our history as going into those territories or whatever, and all the collateral damage of the Crusades. But the Crusades were also a reaction. I mean, am I wrong here?
No, you're absolutely right. There were 450 years of unanswered jihad attacks that had conquered over half of what had been the Christian world before there was ever a crusade. The Crusades were a tardy, defensive, small-scale reaction after those 450 years of jihad. And all they ever succeeded in doing was recapturing a tiny sliver of the land that had been captured in that 450 years of jihad, and holding that sliver of land for 200 years, which was really not very important in the larger scheme of things, but it did accomplish one thing. If it had not been for those 200 years, you look at the history of the jihad against Europe, and it went on for well over 1,000 years. but there was a 200-year interruption. And that's when the Crusaders took the fight back to the Middle East. If there had not been that 200-year interruption, it is virtually certain that Europe would have been conquered and Islamized. And we wouldn't be having this conversation today because there wouldn't have been free societies in the West to give birth to the New World. The New World, if it had been discovered at all, would be Islamic.
So let's say let's say they had done that and turned the whole world Islamic. What would the world, as of whatever year they would be calling this, be? Would we have the internet? Would we have Zoom calls, smartphones, so forth? I mean, it doesn't seem. I have to go back through my lexicon here, but it doesn't seem as if many inventions of modern day. I mean, there's algebra, which is literally an Arabic word, my understanding, and alcohol is Arabic. But beyond those inventions, they don't really use the alcohol very much. I'm not sure about the algebra. But where would society be? Would we have universities? Would we have, kind of this? I think science has been perverted of late, but would we have had the, scientific method extant?
It's hard to say what we would have and what we wouldn't in a very specific way, because you never know what there might have been in terms of human innovation, because human beings by nature desire to know and to learn new things. But there's no doubt that Islam does discourage intellectual exploration. And there are several reasons for that. One is chapter 5, verse 101 and 102 of the Quran, which says, don't ask questions. People have lost their faith by asking questions. That's one problem. Another is chapter 5, verse 64, which says the Jews say that Allah's hand is chained. And this is presented as this terrible thing because Allah's hand is not chained. Now, you might think, what does that have to do with intellectual exploration? It has everything to do with it, because Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher, he wrote about his frustration in dealing with the medieval Muslim philosophers, because he said they didn't believe in the consistency of the universe, because that would mean Allah's hand was chained. And so they could not look at the stars and other observable phenomena and extrapolate from those observations into formulating principles, because they didn't believe that those would necessarily be the same the next day. Allah could change them if he wanted to. He could turn the river into a horse tomorrow. So you can't make a science on that basis. Science depends upon the consistency of the observable phenomena that you are watching and studying. And so science only developed in the West and not in the Islamic world.
Yeah, and sometimes in contravention of the church in the West. There's Galileo. But I think a secondary aspect of it is that you can't think the think you want to think, to quote Dr. Seuss, all the wonderful things I can think. But you can't think those things if you're potentially, even there's a small chance, a 1% chance, you're going to have your head slit off by virtue of having thought it. You need to have the freedom to do so. I mean, the reason, teleologically, I think the reason humans have taken over the world versus raccoons or badgers or snakes or whatever is that we have we have hands. So we have prehensile hands. We can grasp things, but so do a lot of chimps and howler monkeys. They also have that. What we have a very long childhood relative to our general age and size. So an elephant has like a 2.5, 3.5-year-old childhood, and ours, proportional to our size, is much, much larger. Say whatever number you want to pick, 13, 15, 16, or these days 26, whatever. We have a very long exploratory phase, and that purpose is to think and ponder and whatnot. And science works on the same concept, that you need kind of this gestational period where your ideas can bounce anywhere. And if they're proscribed from doing so religiously and with a force, which is essentially the essence of how that religion has spread, I think it's inimical to the scientific project and a bunch of other projects as well. And so I think you're left with the marketplace, perhaps. I mean, I think it's okay to sell dates not the Tinder type, but the fruit, and maybe a few other things and whatnot, but and build your house and so forth. But I think it's going to, it doesn't. It's not. I don't think it's a mistake or an error that most of your Islamic societies, pretty much look, kind of the way they did ages ago. I mean, I think the buildings have changed in a lot of places, but in traditional Islam, I think the dress and the kind of social activities such as they are haven't.
Well, there were the great philosophers in Islamic history. And I remember being in college and learning about Avicenna and Averroes and the rest of them, uh, who were the supposedly towering figures of medieval philosophy who influenced the development of philosophy in Christian Europe. And indeed, Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic theologian and philosopher, he used Avicenna and Averroes quite liberally. And so people say, see, it was the Islamic philosophical tradition that made for the Renaissance in Europe. When actually, what they don't tell you is that those people were declared heretics. And one of the most important works of philosophy in the Islamic world is actually a book of anti philosophy by Al Ghazali, the great Sufi master, who wrote a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, which argues that the philosophers are violating the Quran and that their idea of what is true is not in accord with Quranic revelation, and thus they must be wrong, and they must be heretics who should be put to death. And that's why I can only name Avicenna and Averroes. There were other Islamic philosophers, and there still are, but they don't have nearly the cultural prominence that the early ones had because they were declared heretical.
So, I was looking at the life of Khomeini, and he studied, I think, in Lebanon. They have their own institutions of theology and whatnot. I assume they have ideas, but they just seem to be of a certain type, which is restrictive. I'm not sure there's a debate going on. Do you consider Khomeini a philosopher, whether you like him as one or not? And is there, I assume there's some room for repetition of his concepts, um, in say more fundamentalist Islam.
Well, he was an imam, which in the Shiite context is an extremely exalted title. It was really extraordinary, as a matter of fact, that he was given it. And so his writings are still revered in the Islamic Republic of Iran and among Shiites. But I certainly wouldn't say that he is any kind of innovative or memorable philosopher. He was really just a Shiite theologian and jurist who was much more concerned with matters of what was lawful and prohibited in Islam than he was with larger philosophical questions. So he had the benefit really of becoming a darling of the Western leftist intelligentsia because he went to France while he was fighting against the Shah's regime. And the Western left, because they hated and still hate the America led world order, they hated the Shah's regime and wanted it overthrown. So they loved Khomeini and exalted him as some sort of an intellectual giant, which I don't think he could justifiably really be characterized as in any sense.
So, is there a place that's Islamic or of a majority Islam religion that you would travel to, or not necessarily you, but one? You know, people, when they make making their travel plans, like, oh, Grand Canyon, whatever, maybe Banff in Canada, parts of Mexico. They have their travel places they can go from the United States. Um, and obviously, there's Europe. Uh, are there places that are not on that list that are Islamic or predominantly Islamic that people can or should or could travel to?
Well, it's very difficult. There was actually a couple a few years back who I would say they were quite naive. They were bicyclists, and they were going to bicycle around the world. And they were going to show how everybody was really the same. And folks is just folks wherever they are. Everybody's the same under the skin, and we're all friends, or can be. And they were, I think, in Uzbekistan and were murdered by jihadis. Um, they probably didn't know anything about jihad because this information has been willfully concealed from the masses in the West. But sure, there are wonderful places to go in the Islamic world that I would like to go to myself, except I'd get killed and go in any Islamic country because I've criticized Muhammad and the Quran and so on. And so if it were known who I was, that would be the end. But there's some very beautiful mosques in Iran in particular. Otherwise, the things that leap to mind are all pre-Islamic. All the pyramids and all that in Egypt. You have the ruins, the Roman ruins in Syria, many of which were actually destroyed by ISIS in about 10 years ago. And so that's kind of like on the order of the Buddhas, the giant Buddhas in Afghanistan, the Bamiyan Buddhas that were destroyed in 2001. This is both of those things were done because they were considered to be idolatrous, and that's forbidden in Islam. So it all had to be smashed. Oh, Palmyra, there's the city, the Roman city in Syria, that it was just ruined by ISIS. Um, but there's of course Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, occupied Constantinople, which was the grandest church in the Christian world for almost 1,000 years, still standing as a mosque. The celebrated icons are covered up now, so I don't know how much value there would be in going, but it's there, it's still standing. Few other things probably. I'm sure Baghdad has some things that are worth seeing, but these are very dangerous places to go for non-Muslims. Remember the Swedish backpacking girls too. It was two girls from Sweden who went hiking in Morocco, and they ended up getting beheaded on video by Islamic State jihadis once again. And people from the West, they travel into Islamic countries and they don't realize what kind of a risk they're undertaking, because those who have been warning about such risks are now tarred as racist, bigoted Islamophobes and not worth listening to. So these people happily go off to Morocco and end up getting beheaded.
So, silly question perhaps, but are you a racist, bigoted Islamophobe?
No, racist, not in the slightest degree, or bigoted, no, not at all. Islamophobic, sure, because people tell me that I'm Islamophobic all the time, and they must be right, right? Because I oppose jihad violence. I don't think that people should be warred against just because they believe differently from how I do. And I don't believe that women should be subjugated. I don't believe that non Muslims should be subjugated under the hegemony of Muslims. I don't believe that the hand should be amputated for theft. I don't believe there should be stoning for adultery. I don't believe that there should be the crucifixion of people who allegedly wage war against Allah. And so people tell me, oh, that's all Islamophobic. Well, it seems to me every human being by that scale ought to be Islamophobic and stand for the rights and dignity of all human beings. But if that's Islamophobic, then okay.
Well, I mean, I think the term, phobia means fear of, and so you could look at it at two different ways. I mean, it's you could certainly, I think, have a reasonable fear of living in Syria currently, as anything but one of Jolani's men. And would that make you Islamophobic, or just kind of just generally, reasonably phobic? You know, uh, I think that
Yeah,
I'm sort of.
it's an interesting thing. In 1974, Turkish troops entered Cyprus and occupied the northern part of the country and declared a state, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, that no state other than Turkey recognizes in the world. And they cleared all the Christians out by force. They closed all the churches. You could buy precious icons that were tremendous works of art for like $1 on the market because they were just flooded with icons from churches that had been forcibly closed in Cyprus. And that was in 1974. And the Turkish occupation of northern Cyprus is still going on. And this week, thousands of Turkish Cypriots in northern Cyprus have been demonstrating against the Turks because they don't want the Turks have removed the ban on the hijab, the headscarf in schools, and they have reintroduced teaching of Islam into the curriculum, which had been based on the secular Turkish curriculum, which has also been rolled back in Turkey itself. And they want the Turkish Cypriots are largely secular. They don't want all this Islam, and they're against Islamization. Now, in the United States, we've constantly told if you're against Islamization, you're a racist, bigoted Islamophobe. So are all those Turkish Muslims who are secular, are they racist, bigoted Islamophobes?
Right. So, I mean, because I'm kind of a word guy, I like cryptograms and puzzles and whatnot. I've thought that the antidote to ISIS is, it turns out SISI was General Sisi. You know, I mean, just as wordplay. But, in the Islamic world, you'll find people who are very blunt about Islamization. There's a guy on X, I think his last name is Taba, he's from the Emirates, and he wears, a head scarf of type, and he's very blunt about, like, we don't put up with this, people want to subjugate people, whatever. That we're not doing that. And I think, maybe the upside would be, I mean, I just don't even know sometimes, but Dubai is not necessarily, it's not New York City, but it's not Tehran either. I don't know what the quote unquote happy medium is going to be, or how far down the pit people have to go before they want to climb out. So I'm going to give you a chance to give us last words, thoughts, directions, and maybe talk about the grooming gangs in the UK and whether there's any kind of realization or people learning. I don't know, where do things stand? Where do we go?
Well, the grooming gangs in the UK are an interesting example of the kind of things we've been talking about, because nobody dares in Britain to discuss what they were motivated by. And the fact is that I actually have a book coming out on this in November called Holy Hell, Islam's Abuse of Women and the Infidels Who Enable It. And you can order it now on Amazon. But in any case, it is a study of the rape gang phenomenon in Britain and other related issues. And I show in it that the British authorities ignored the rape gangs for years and let them operate, and wouldn't arrest them, wouldn't do anything, because they were afraid of being called racist and Islamophobic. And even to this day, there have been a couple of courageous politicians who say, most of the people who did these rapes are Pakistanis. And they got a lot of trouble for saying that. But nobody dares, except for Tommy Robinson, who's in solitary in prison. Nobody dares to say this is an Islamic thing. But the fact is that the Quran allows for the capture and captivity and rape of infidel women. This is abundantly explained. It's in several places. Chapter 4, verse 3, 4, verse 24, 23, verses 1 to 6, 33:50, and 70:30. And there's a whole theology of this, the captives of the right hand, who are essentially sex slaves. And this is what the British Muslim rape gangs were operating on, and they even were explicit about it on more than one occasion. But it's absolute taboo, even now in Britain. And if you say it, you're racist and bigoted and Islamophobic. And so it just keeps on going, because you can't really cure a problem unless you diagnose it properly, and everybody's afraid to do that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Spencer. People can find you at Jihad Watch. I'm going to put up your book again here. So the most recent book is Antisemitism, History and Myth, and they can find you on Amazon here. And you have your other books. Holy Hell is coming out. You mentioned, um, and people can pre-order that. And also Jihad Watch, I'll put up here. People obviously can find it easily enough. They just have to spell the term. Um, and if you want to help support my video cast, you can buy something totally unrelated to this, but you can purchase my book, Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. I've got a couple other books on the way. I'll talk about those at a later date. So any final last words?
We live in an empire of lies, and it's very important to try to find the truth and hold on to it. It is not what you're being told. Very important to do your own research and go beyond what's in the news, see what's really happening for yourself.
Well, thank you so much. There's actually a book, The Empire of Lies by Andrew Klavan, but it's very apt. It's a good book, too. So thank you so much for being on my show. I appreciate it.
Thank you.